probably 22 years or so. He is the Dean Emeritus of the Pardes Institute of Jewish Studies. He was the Dean of Pardes since 1998 and moved into the Dean Emeritus position recently, but still working there. Pardes is a wonderful place in Jerusalem where Rabbi Infeld and I each spent a year studying, just a little bit before starting rabbinical school. This was about 20 years ago for me, and a few years earlier, I won't say how many, for Rabbi Infeld. Dr. Bernstein holds a BA and MA in history and a PhD in religious education from New York University. He also attended Yeshivat HaMivtar, a yeshiva in Efrat near Jerusalem in Israel. Before working at Pardes, David was the director of Midreshet Lindenbaum. Many people know it as Bravenders, where many have studied over the years. Many young women after high school. He was there for 12 years. He was also a Jerusalem Fellow at the Mandel School for Jewish Education. And one thing that I want to point out that's very relevant to his talk today, The Pen and the Sword in the Warsaw Ghetto, is that Dr. Bernstein has taken adult and student groups on Jewish heritage to Poland, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, and Berlin. And he's done these trips as an educator for, I'm well over 20 years, maybe more. And I shouldn't personally on those trips. Before I studied at Pardes with Dave, I was at university for a year, just like I did.
Rabbi Stein, you're cutting out a lot. I think it's not just me.
Yep.
Yeah, no, you keep breaking up.
I think Rabbi Stein is actually frozen. If I can just ask everyone to stay on mute, and we will. I don't think we'll be able to unfreeze Rabbi Stein, but I think that what Rabbi Stein was saying is he's been on a trip with Dr. Bernstein, and maybe Rabbi Stein, are you back with us?
Am I back?
Yeah, we lost most of what you said at the end, but
okay.
Maybe.
So I was. I hope you caught a little bit of that. I was on a trip with Dr. Bernstein when I was spending a year at Hebrew University, just like Rabbi Blumen did, just like Rabbi Infeld did. And I went on a trip to Poland for a week with other students at Hebrew University, and Dr. Bernstein was one of the educators. And I want to say that when he teaches on these trips in Europe, and he knows so much about the Jewish communities there, but he really makes sure to teach not just about the death and destruction of our people in Poland and surrounding countries during the Shoah, the Holocaust. But he also equally, I would say, emphasizes the amazing Jewish life that thrived in so many cities and towns and villages, shtetls, for 1,000 years there. And it's so important to learn about what Jewish life was there during that time, and not just to see how the destruction of that Jewish life happened. And he also makes sure to point out the Jewish life that still exists, or in some cases it started to grow again in some of the places he visits on those trips. And so we're so excited, and I hope you could hear some of what I was saying. Sorry about my internet connection. We're so excited, Dr. Bernstein, to do this evening. And thank you for joining us from your home in Jerusalem at an early hour for you and a late evening for us.
Thank you, Rabbi Stein. Thank you, Rabbi Infeld. It's a pleasure to be here with you. I apologize, I have a little bit of a cold, but it shouldn't be worse than this. So we're approaching Hanukkah. We light the first candle on Sunday night. And I thought that it might be appropriate to share with you the story of Jewish heroism, but not Jewish heroism in the Maccabean period, but during a more recent period, that is in the Warsaw Ghetto. So just as a little bit of background, 1939, Warsaw is the largest Jewish community in the world, except for New York. There are about 380,000 Jews living in Warsaw. They constituted about a third of the city's population. And if it was second to New York in numbers, it probably was not second to New York in terms of leadership, in terms of great Torah scholars, in terms of Yiddish language and literature and theater, in terms of Jewish socialism. The Jews of Warsaw really were at the forefront of all of these movements and more. September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland and World War II begins. And it's not by chance that on Rosh Hashanah, 1939, the Nazis choose to bomb the Jewish neighborhoods of Warsaw. On Rosh Hashanah, 1939. And it's not by chance that a year later, on Rosh Hashanah, 1940, the Germans announce that all of the Jews of Warsaw will have to move into what they called a Jewish residential district, what we call the Warsaw Ghetto. And it's not by chance that on Yom Kippur, 10 days later, the Nazis announced that all of this had to be completed within a few weeks' time. The Nazi war against the Jews was not only a war of physical destruction, but it was a psychological war against the Jews. Jewish holidays, which are meant to infuse us with spiritual uplifting and are meant to bring us together as a community, instead, the Nazis used those occasions, in particular, to strike at the morale of the Jewish people, so that instead of being uplifted and strengthened by our holidays, the Nazis made sure, oftentimes, to use those holidays as a way of destroying Jewish morale. In November 1940, the Jews do in fact have to move into the ghetto, and I'll share my screen here. Here are pictures of Jews moving into the ghetto, November of 1940. The ghetto was located in what had been a Jewish neighborhood, but nonetheless, there were Polish Catholics living there who had to forcibly be moved out. And Jews from all over the city who didn't live in that neighborhood had to go in. And of course, you couldn't take everything with you. And I want to...
David, sorry, we can't see your screen.
You didn't see my screen?
No, sorry.
Oh. Oh boy. Okay, I'm sorry to hear that. Let me look to see if, do you see it now? Do you see it now?
No, not yet.
Oh boy. Okay, I'm going to have a technical difficulty here and I don't know if I'll be able to overcome it. So we will manage without the screen share. Raoul Hilberg, who wrote one of the first academic histories of the Holocaust called The Destruction of the European Jews in 1961, I believe, identified 4 stages in the destruction of Polish Jewry. And all of those were connected with the ghetto period. The first stage was concentration. Not only were all of the Jews of Warsaw brought into a small area, which was 2% of the city, when they had been about 30% of the city's population. But the Nazis also bring in Jews from surrounding towns. And so the number of Jews in Warsaw swells to about 450,000. Hold on one second. I'm just going to send something to, send this to Adam. Hold on one second. Sorry for the interruption.
If we could, we'll see if we can get the slides up, because I know it'll probably add to your words.
Yeah. So I'm just sending this. I saw it on my screen, so I just assumed that you would see it on mine, but that was not the case. So now I'm sending it to Rabbi Stein, and hopefully it will all be okay. 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 So the Nazis purposely create tremendously overcrowded conditions in the ghetto. So much so that when they'll begin to deport Jews from the ghetto, they will close off sections of the ghetto in order to keep it very crowded. What does crowding mean? Crowding means that the average was 6 or 7 people to a room. So imagine it's just wall-to-wall beds, wall-to-wall mattresses. And imagine for a moment what that means in an apartment, not a private home. We're talking about apartments. We're talking about the 1930s in Poland, 1940 in Poland. There was only one bathroom. Maybe there were 3 bedrooms and a kitchen. But now, instead of one family in that apartment, you now had 2 or 3 families in that same apartment, sharing a kitchen, sharing a bathroom, perhaps 15 or 20 people sharing the same bathroom. What does it mean for hygiene? What does it mean for privacy? A sense of space that we all need. What does it mean? Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much. What does it mean for the stress that one undergoes being in such a situation? You could stop the screen share now. We'll come back to it. Thank you. I'd rather see people's faces. What does it mean for the stress of everyday life, living under such crowded conditions with families that it's not your family? You may not know them, you may not like them. And you're thrown together, not for a day, but you're thrown together for month after month after month after month. On top of the stress of the starvation that existed in the ghetto, and worrying about how will I find bread for my child or for my elderly parent. In fact, Lucy Dvorivitz, in her book, The War Against the Jews, wrote something that when I read it, I did a double take. She wrote that the greatest disease killer in the ghetto was not cholera, and there was a cholera epidemic, and not dysentery, and dysentery was very common. The biggest disease killer in the Warsaw Ghetto was heart disease, from the stress of everyday life. The second stage, according to Raoul Hilberg, after concentration was confiscation. Confiscation meaning homes were confiscated, businesses, factories, bank accounts, stocks, cars, phones. They were all confiscated by the Germans. And the Germans did this for 2 reasons. Number one, to enrich themselves and to use these resources that used to belong to the Jewish population. But they did it for a second reason too. When you take away people's wealth, you make them more vulnerable. When you have money, when you have assets, you have options. There's somebody you can give money to who'll do you a favor. But by stripping the Jews of their possessions, the Nazis made them much more vulnerable. So we've talked about concentration, confiscation. The third stage Raoul Hilberg identifies is weakening, the physical weakening of the Jewish population of Warsaw. The Nazis provided very little food. According to Alexander Donat, who was incarcerated in the ghetto, 80% of the food in the ghetto was smuggled in. And Adam, I want to go back to the screen share. Let's talk about smuggling for a moment. I think the next slide, after the Jews moving into the ghetto. Yes, Henryka Lazarwort was a Jew living in the ghetto who wrote this poem in Polish, The Little Smuggler. Over the wall, through holes and past the guard, through the wires, ruins, and fences, plucky, hungry, and determined, I sneak through, dart like a cat. At noon, at night, at dawn, in snowstorm, cold or heat, 100 times I risk my life and put my head on the line. Under my arm, a gunny sack, tatters on my back, on nimble young feet, with endless fear in my heart. But one must endure it all. One must bear it all so that tomorrow morning the fine folk can eat their fill. She's referring here to the fact that there was a small number of people in the ghetto, many of them big-time smugglers, not like this little smuggler, who literally ate caviar in the ghetto. Over the wall, through holes and bricks, at night, at dawn, at noon, plucky, hungry, artful, I move silently like a shadow. And if the hand of destiny should seize me in the game, that's a common trick of life. You, mother, do not wait up for me. I will return no more to you. My voice will not be heard from afar. The dust of the street will bury the lost fate of a child. And only one request will stiffen on my lips. Who, mother mine, who will bring your bread tomorrow? Stop the screen share now. So this is the weakening, the physical weakening of the Jews. Concentration, confiscation, weakening, and the final stage, deportation. Deportation, in the case of the Warsaw Ghetto, beginning in the summer of 1942, what are generally called the Great Deportations began, when the majority of the ghetto, about 300,000 Jews, were taken to Treblinka, a death camp, where most of them were killed within hours of their arrival. And that was the fate of most of the Warsaw Ghetto. And those great deportations took place in a period of only a couple of months. It was an intense time of murder. Up until the Great Deportations in the summer of 1942, there was a great debate in the ghetto. How shall we respond to our terrible conditions? And for the most part, the leadership of the Jews in the ghetto, the Judenrat, the Jewish Council, and many of the other leaders in the ghetto urged restraint. They urged restraint for a very simple reason. What would resistance get us? It'll get us only reprisals. We have learned from our history that the way Jews have survived in the diaspora for 2,000 years has been by the doctrine of Überleben, outliving. We'll figure out a way. We'll bribe this one. We'll get around that one. And we'll somehow manage to survive persecution. That's the way Jews survived traditionally. And that's the way the ghetto leadership advocated responding to the Nazis. We're not going to defeat the Nazis militarily. It's hopeless to resist. The only thing we can hope to do is to accommodate them and hope that most of us will survive. Of course, the Great Deportations changed that. Because even though the Nazis tried to deceive the Jews and told them they were being resettled in the East, word eventually got back to people in the ghetto that the Jews were taken to Treblinka. And so as more and more Jews believe that the Nazis are lying, that you're not being resettled in the East where there's more space and room and you'll work and you'll live and conditions will be better, but rather that you're being taken to your death, there's more and more support for those young people in the various youth movements who are advocating armed resistance. And if we can go back to the slideshow, Adam, for a moment. Adam Chernyakov. This is the head of the Judenrat, the head of the Jewish Council, sitting in his office. You can see he's wearing an armband with a Star of David on it, on his right arm, which Jews had to do even in the ghetto. And you see that he's meeting here with some people. Adam Chernyakov, as the leader of the Judenrat, believed the Nazis when they said that the Jews would not be deported. But in July of 1942, when they ordered him to have 5,000 Jews a day ready at the train station, he understood he had been duped. Adam Chernyakov, whose diary we have, and I'll explain why, Adam Chernyakov then took cyanide, committed suicide, rather than be a party to the murder of his people. If we go to the next slide, Adam, excuse me, Rabbi Stein, I'm used to calling him Adam. We see a picture of Mordechai Anilevich. Mordechai Anilevich was one of the leaders of the armed resistance in the ghetto. He led what was called the Zhub, the Jewish Fighting Organization in the ghetto, which was a coalition, actually quite a broad coalition of Jewish groups, mostly young people. You could see his age. He was 24 years old when he commanded the Jewish fighters in the ghetto. And it ran a gamut from the communists to the Bundists, to the social Zionists, to the religious Zionists, and others. And if we go to the next slide, Rabbi Stein, a less well-known figure, Pavel Frankel, who was the commander of the ZZV, the ZZF, which was the Jewish military organization, which was the revisionist Zionists who refused to join, together with the Job under Mordechai Anilevich. And even though they refused to join, their actions were coordinated, but they were a separate group. Together, we're talking about a total of 750 fighters, very lightly armed. It was very hard to procure arms. And very few of them had military training. Actually, Pavel Frankel's fighters had more veterans of the Polish army. And in April of 1943, when German troops entered the ghetto, they were met by a hail of Molotov cocktails and gunfire. They suffered casualties, and they actually retreated from the ghetto. It was Erev Pesach. It was Passover Eve. And Tzivia Lubetkin, one of the women fighters who survived the war and later became a member of the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, Tzivia Lubetkin writes about how joyous that moment was when she said, when she wrote, quote, "We finally saw German blood on the streets of Warsaw after seeing so much Jewish blood on the streets of Warsaw." The fighters held out for weeks. It was only in May 1943 that the Germans could declare victory over these very lightly armed and mostly inexperienced fighters. They held out longer than France. They held out longer than Poland did. And when the Germans declared victory, General Stroop symbolically dynamited the Great Synagogue of Warsaw. and sent a cable to Berlin. The Jewish residential district of Warsaw is no more. That is, the greatest Jewish community in Europe was now destroyed. That is one kind of Jewish heroism. But I want to move to the next slide. Yeah, sorry, there are two more slides here. Here are pictures that the Germans took as they arrested Jews. You could see the smoke in the background because when the Germans came back to the ghetto, they came back not only more heavily armed, this time not surprised, and with tanks and artillery, but they also had a new strategy, and that was to burn almost every building in the ghetto, to set them on fire, in order not only to drive out the fighters, but those Jews who were in hiding, who didn't want to be deported. There's one more slide on the uprising. This is an iconic photograph. To me, this is a photograph that speaks of Jewish helplessness. The little boy with his arms raised, to me, is a symbol of Jewish helplessness during the Shoah. Let's continue to the next slide. I titled this session, The Pen and the Sword. And I'd like to now move on to the pen. Emanuel Ringelblum. Emanuel Ringelblum was born in 1900 in the Galician town of Buchach. If you've ever heard of Buchach, it's probably because Shai Agnon, the Israeli Nobel Prize winner for literature, was born there and wrote about it. He was born into a religious Zionist family. He, like many other young people of his generation, moved away from religious observance, but nonetheless remained intensely Jewish and became a passionate socialist Zionist. His field of study was history, and he wrote his doctorate about the history of the Jews of Warsaw. And in 1938, when Germany expelled thousands of what they called Ostjuden, Jews from the East, Jews who had been coming in from Poland in the interwar period, and dumped them on the Polish border, and Poland refused to accept them. And they sat on the border as in the fall of 1938 in the cold. It was Emanuel Ringelblum who was one of the organizers of relief for those refugees. And he had a particular ideology. We could stop the screen share now, Rabbi Stein. He had a particular ideology about helping the refugees. He didn't believe in the typical philanthropy where wealthy people decide how the money is going to be spent. Rather, he believed in something that in Yiddish is called Alleinhilfe, helping oneself. That is, he believed that the people themselves had to be part of the process. This fit in very well with his socialist ideology. He believed very much in the power of the people, and in fact, he was one of those historians at the time who was urging simple Jews to collect objects in order to create historical evidence of the time in which they lived. On September 1st, 1939, when the war began, he began to write a diary, sensing that these were momentous times. There were many diarists in the Warsaw Ghetto. He was not alone. But Emanuel Ringelblum was unique in that he went far beyond his own diary. He organized a group of about 60 men and women from all walks of life. Some were historians, some were writers, some were journalists, some were teachers, some were rabbis, some were atheists. Some were on the political right, some on the political left. Some were Bundists, some were Zionists, some were neither. He brought together this very diverse group, and they called themselves Onik Shabbos, Onik Shabbat. They called themselves Onik Shabbat because they would meet every Shabbat afternoon in the Jewish Historical Institute, a building that was within the ghetto. And they would meet in order to try to record everything that was going on in the ghetto. And Emanuel Ringelblum was very advanced for his time period. He understood that nothing is objective, that everything is subjective, something that only started to be understood really with postmodernism. And he wrote that the best we can do is to try to look at the same event from different perspectives. That way we'll get a whole picture, a fuller picture. They organized research projects in the ghetto. For example, the role of women in the ghetto. This was decades before any university had a women's studies course. The role of religious life in the ghetto. They organized poetry writing contests for teenagers about their life in the ghetto. They collected theater tickets from performances in the ghetto, report cards from schools in the ghetto. By the way, there was even a medical school in the Warsaw Ghetto. There were Jews who were medical students, there were Jews who were medical professors, and they organized a medical school in the ghetto. They collected candy wrappers. They collected every piece of evidence they could. They were driven by a feeling that the story of the Warsaw Ghetto had to be told by the Jews themselves and not only by the Nazis. That if the Nazis would be victorious, it would only be their version of history that would exist. And about a dozen years ago, Professor Sam Kassow of Trinity College wrote an unbelievable biography of Emanuel Ringelblum. It is the biography of Emanuel Ringelblum, called Who Will Write Our History? That's what was on Emanuel Ringelblum's mind. The power of the pen. Who will write our history? Will the Germans write the history of the Warsaw Ghetto from their perspective? Or will we try to collect enough documents that one day somebody else will uncover what really happened to the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto? The truth is that Emanuel Ringelblum's Onik Shabbos group did more than just keep the history of the ghetto alive. They actually, through couriers, through refugees who came to the Warsaw Ghetto, they actually managed to get a tremendous amount of information about what was going on outside of Warsaw. In fact, it was the Onik Shabbos group that first sent word to the BBC in London about the mass murder of the Jews of Poland. And in December 1942, the BBC reported that 700,000 Polish Jews had been murdered by the Germans. That information was from the Onik Shabbos group. The members of Onik Shabbos were sure that once this broadcast would be made, that the citizens of Germany would rise up in disgust, and it would force the Nazis to stop the final solution. Of course, they were wrong. That we can say with 20/20 hindsight. Emanuel Ringelblum wrote about Polish-Jewish relations during the war. And he was cognizant of the fact that the Poles were also suffering at the hands of the Germans. But nonetheless, he felt that they were not doing enough. He called it their civic duty to help their fellow citizens of the Jewish faith. Emanuel Ringelblum during the uprising, oh, by the way, sorry, let's go back to the screen share. Emanuel Ringelblum and the Onyx Shabbos group obtained the diary of Adam Chernyakov. That's why we have it, the head of the Judenrat, the one who committed suicide rather than aid in the deportation of the Jews. And let's go on to the next slide. One of the most important spiritual figures in the ghetto was Rabbi Kalman Kalonymus Shapira, the Piaseczna Rebbe, the Eish Kodesh. He was a Rosh Yeshiva, the head of a Talmudic academy called Darchei Moshe, which had hundreds of students in Warsaw before the war. And he would give a sermon every Shabbat morning. And then he would write the notes Saturday night when Shabbat was over. And his collected notes about the sermons that he gave were given over to the Onyx Shabbos group. And today, I think we already have 3 editions of what's called the Eish Kodesh, his book, The Holy Fire. Rabbi Art Green translated some of what he wrote. Truly remarkable primary source of what was going on in the ghetto and how this important rabbinic figure was responding to it. Let's go to the next slide. Here's Emanuel Ringelblum with his son Uri. Emanuel Ringelblum and his wife and his son Uri escaped from the ghetto during the uprising in April 1943. And they find shelter with a Polish Catholic family. Just outside of Warsaw, there was a Polish family that was hiding some 30 Jews on a farm. And the penalty, by the way, of helping a Jew during the war in occupied Poland was death. So these were truly courageous people. Tragically, the daughter of the farmer's family broke up with her boyfriend, and the boyfriend, seeking revenge, informed on the family. The members of the farmer's family were murdered. The 30-some Jews were taken to the notorious SS prison in Warsaw, the Pawiak prison. And there, Emanuel Ringelblum sat with his son. I don't think they were smiling as they are in this picture. His son was on his lap. His wife was in the women's prison. They were separated. And a member of the underground came to Emanuel Ringelblum, who was a very important figure in the ghetto. A member of the underground came to him and said, "We can get you out. If you say you're a shoemaker, we can get you out." And Emanuel Ringelblum looked at him and said, "What about my son Uri? What about my wife?" And the member of the resistance writes, "I was silent. I had no words because I knew we could not save his wife and his son. And Emanuel Ringelblum, hearing the silence, answered, if I can't go with my wife and my child, then I prefer to go the way of Kiddush Hashem. I prefer to die as a martyr. And he was killed by the Nazis in 1944, together with his wife and his son. This is a different kind of heroism. This is the kind of heroism that it's sometimes a little harder to see. Not the person who takes up an arm of some kind, a weapon, but a parent who says, I'm not leaving my child. Emanuel Ringelblum, I mentioned, was brought up in a religious home. He was no longer observant. But he writes in his diary, I should really go to the mikveh, to the ritual bath every morning, as a Torah scribe does, lest I make one mistake in one letter of what I am writing. Warsaw is liberated by the Red Army in the summer of 1944. And Warsaw is 80 to 90% destroyed. It was destroyed by the Nazi bombings at the beginning of the war. It was destroyed because the ghetto area was almost totally demolished, the buildings being burned. And then there was a Polish revolt in August 1944, which led to more destruction. If you go to Warsaw today, you'll see that the vast majority of the buildings are post-war. There's very little that remains, unlike a city like Krakow, where there was no fighting and the buildings survived. Of the 60 members of Einik Shabbos, only 2 of them survived. Sorry, 3. 3 of them survived. Hirsch Wasser, his wife, and Rachel Auerbach. Those were the 3 survivors of the 60 members of Einik Shabbos. And shortly after the war, in 1946, we can go to the next slide. Here's one of the milk cans that was used to bury the documents of the Einik Shabbos group. You might have seen them either at Yad Vashem or the US Holocaust Museum in Washington. Let's go to the next slide. They buried the documents. And in 1946, Hirsch Wasser organizes literally an archaeological expedition because he knew, he was one of the few people who knew where the documents were buried. And he goes to that place. You could see that there's a tin box that they're taking out, but it's very hard to find the place. The streets were not recognizable anymore. It was all rubble. Nonetheless, they managed to find the first collection of documents in 1946. In 1950, a Polish construction crew accidentally comes upon the second collection of documents, of milk cans and tin boxes, tens of thousands of documents. The third collection has never been found. Hirsch Wasser knew the address. Today, it's actually the address of the Chinese embassy in Warsaw. And about a decade ago, Israeli researchers asked the Chinese embassy if they could go into the embassy and dig underneath to try to find the documents. You can only imagine what is going through the minds of the Chinese at the time. An Israeli crew is coming into their embassy, and the Chinese actually let them come, but they were not able to find. And Professor Sam Kassow, when I asked him, told me he doesn't think that the third collection will ever be found. The third collection actually documents the period of the uprising and has not yet been found, and according to Sam Kassow, as I said, may never be found. When the great Jewish historian Shimon Dubnov, but you know Jerusalem, the Jerusalem Theater is on the street that's named for him. When the great Jewish historian Shimon Dubnov, who was in the Riga Ghetto, was about to be executed, his last words were, Yidden schreib, Jews write. Emanuel Ringelblum had gotten that message before Shimon Dubnov had said those words. It's interesting that Shimon Dubnov did not say Jews rise up, because ultimately that was hopeless. But he said Jews write, because that was an investment in the future. And Emanuel Ringelblum, I think, personifies that. Let's go to the next slide. Rabbi Stein, can we go to the next slide? Thank you. I want to share with you Israel Lichtenstein's last testament, which was found among the items in the Onyx Shabbos archive. With zeal and zest, I threw myself into the work to help assemble archive materials. He was a member of Onyx Shabbos. I was entrusted to be the custodian. I hid the material. Besides me, no one knew. I confided only in my friend Hirsch Wasser, my superior. He was the one who survived and knew where to look. It is well hidden. Please God that it be preserved. That will be the finest and best that we achieved in the present gruesome time. I know that we will not endure. To survive and remain alive after such horrible murders and massacres is impossible. Therefore, I write this testament of mine. Perhaps I am not worthy of being remembered, but just for my grit in working with the society Onyx Shabbat, and for being the most endangered because I hid the entire material. It would be a small thing to give my own head. I risk the head of my dear wife, Gela Sextine, and my treasure, my little daughter, Margalit. I don't want any gratitude, any monument, any praise. I want only a remembrance, so that my family, brother and sister abroad, may know what has become of my remains. I want my wife to be remembered. Gela Sextine, artist, dozens of works, talented, didn't manage to exhibit, did not show in public. During the 3 years of war, worked among children as educator, teacher, made stage sets, costumes for the children's productions, received awards. Now together with me, we are preparing to receive death. I want my little daughter to be remembered. Margalit, 20 months old today, has mastered Yiddish perfectly, speaks a pure Yiddish. At 9 months, began to speak Yiddish clearly. In intelligence, she is on a par of 3 or 4-year-old children. I don't want to brag about her. Witnesses to this who tell me about it are the teaching staff of the school at Novolipki 68. By the way, it was under that school that the first collection of documents was buried. I am not sorry about my life and that of my wife, but I am sorry for the gifted little girl. She deserves to be remembered also. May we be the redeemers of all of the rest of the Jews in the whole world. I believe in the survival of our people. Jews will not be annihilated. We, the Jews of Poland, Czechoslovakia, Lithuania, Latvia, are the scapegoat for all Israel and all the other lands. Dated July 31st, 1942. the 11th day of the so-called resettlement action, meaning the Great Deportations, in reality an annihilation action. It is almost 80 years later. And we, me in Jerusalem and you in Vancouver, we remember Israel Lichtenstein. We remember his wife, Gela Sexteen. We remember their daughter, Margalit. That was his last wish, that they be remembered. And 80 years later, we remember them. Thank you very much.
That was a tremendous presentation. Absolutely excellent. Thank you. Are there any, Rabbi Stein, did you have any questions?
Yeah, I have a couple of questions that have been passed on to me from Diane. Either they might be from Diane or from, at least one of them is from a congregant who asked her. David, remind us, what is the name of the full name of the woman you talked about who survived and held a Knesset seat? Someone was asking.
Tivia Lubetkin. Lubetkin. Tivia Lubetkin. By the way, her granddaughter was the first female pilot in the Israeli Air Force.
Wow.
So you don't mess with the Lubetkins.
Another person asked, what was the name of the family who hid, I think it was Manuel Ringelblum's family on the farm, then the boyfriend and
yeah, I don't know. I don't know the name of the family. There are more documented Polish rescuers, righteous among the nations, according to Yad Vashem, than from any other nation. Of course, there were more Jews in Poland than in any other nation under Nazi rule. But every one of them risked their lives to save Jews. And there were a few thousand that we know of who were murdered by the Nazis precisely for that reason.
So those are the questions that have been passed to us. I'll maybe just add one more before we get some thank yous and announcements from Rabbi Infeld. One final question. Dr. Bernstein, is anything you can share with us about your personal journey? What has it been like inside for you as you've taught this material about the Jewish life in Europe for hundreds of years and the destruction of Jewish life in the time of the Shoah and visited so many times? Some people visit and say, I can't imagine ever visiting again, but you visited for the purposes of education 20 or 30 or 40 times.
Yes. I have a sense of mission. My parents were Polish Jews. My grandparents were all murdered by the Nazis. My aunt was murdered by the Nazis. My parents managed to survive by fleeing to the Soviet Union. That's how the majority of Polish Jews who survived. 90% of Polish Jews were killed. I'll say it one more time. 90% of Polish Jewry was murdered by the Germans. Only 10% survived. The vast majority of that 10% who survived by fleeing to the Soviet Union. So I'm named for my two grandfathers, whom I never met. And my bedtime stories that my parents told me, they never told me a fairy tale. I didn't know about fairy tales until I was a little older. My parents' bedtime stories were stories about life in Brody, Poland before the war and how they managed to escape and all of the miracles that happened along the way because they went penniless, not knowing the language, not knowing where they were going. Those are my bedtime stories. So it's not surprising that I became a student of history. And it's not surprising that after the Iron Curtain fell and the possibility of going to Poland opened up, that would be something of great interest to me. And as a Jewish educator, I feel that the legacy of Polish Jewry is something that is worth sharing. As Rabbi Stein said earlier, not only their death, but also the very vibrant life of Polish Jewry. So for me, it's not boring to go back. It's not repetitious. It's actually a sense of mission. Well,
again, we want to thank you for this wonderful presentation. By the way, also as the people on our members know, as the son of Holocaust survivors, my mother being from Germany and my father from Poland, from Krakow, I can completely understand your emotional and academic connection to the familial aspect of this history. And I would say that, I know that you probably want to eat breakfast, say shachrit and eat breakfast at some point, but we could all easily stay on for another hour and hear more. But we absolutely wonderful presentation. We want to thank you. I'm going to actually share my screen for a moment because we've got a lot of wonderful prime time coming up. We have the third part.
I'm going to take my leave. Thank you very much for the opportunity to teach you.
Oh, actually, I was going to ask you one more question if that's okay in a minute, but
okay, go ahead.
Are you okay holding on for a minute?
Sure.
Are you sure? Okay. I just wanted to share just a couple pieces. Number one is that next week we have one last piece of prime time, which is of this Hanukkah series, which is Lisa Richland, who recently moved back to Vancouver, whose parents actually were married at Beth Israel, and she was living in Jerusalem up until just a few months ago, is going to be speaking about Israeli politics today, a fragile coalition. And that's and of course, relating it to Hanukkah and the political, we will relate it to Hanukkah and the political nature of the Hashmoneans, and which was often a fraught political coalition and political existence. So we look forward to hearing from Lisa, who recently received her Ph.D. as well from Ben Gurion University. And then finally, just one other announcement is in the fortnight after that, we are happy to announce a new series, a new three-part series called Making a Life of Meaning, Making the Most of Time. And that series is going to start with Rabbi David Zvi Kalman, who works for the Hartman Institute, speaking about technology and time, life on the clock. And you can see after him, we'll actually have Rabbi Ilana Zeman. And we are very excited that entire series is sponsored by Bob Markin in loving memory of his late brothers, Ralph and Ron. So please join us for all of the above. And finally, Dr. Bernstein, just one final question, which is I was interested, especially considering the connection of this particular presentation being part of the Hanukkah series and connecting it to modern Israel. I know that, of course, the Warsaw Ghetto uprising is very prominent in Israeli education, and probably I couldn't imagine that there's any Israeli teen who doesn't know of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. But what about Oneg Shabbos? Is this something that's taught in Israeli schools? And if it is, why? And if it isn't, why as well? Thank you.
I think that Israel and I think Jews all over the world have gone through an evolution in how we view the Shoah. I remember in the 1960s and 70s when I was living in New York, when I was a counselor in summer camp, youth group leader, teaching at a Jewish day school, the question of resistance was the biggest question. Young people would ask, why didn't the Jews resist? And resistance was held up both in Israel and among, I think, American Jews too, as being, the quintessential response to the Nazis. There were very few Yom HaShoah observances in America in the 1960s and 70s. But the largest one was at Temple Emmanuel in New York, sponsored by the Warsaw Ghetto Resistance Organization. People who had survived the Warsaw Ghetto and identified themselves as partisans or as fighters, and they were the ones who were observing Yom HaShoah. But I think that we've come past that. I think that while we recognize that kind of heroism, and it was definitely a kind of heroism, I think that in Israel in the 1980s, they started a practice called the Kol Ish Yesh Shem. That is remembering that every person was an individual and recognizing the heroism of the unsung heroes, the people who didn't leave their families. Abba Kovner, who was the leader of the partisans in Vilna Ghetto and then in the Vilna forests. Abba Kovner, when he was going to leave the ghetto, he went to his mother and told her he was leaving. And she said to him, "Why do you go?" She was living alone and depended on him. And he said, "I don't know." And he wrote later, "I don't know what was more heroic, to go fight and lead the partisans in the forests, or to stay with my elderly mother who needed my help." And I think that all over the Jewish world, there's been a turn towards recognizing that there was more than one kind of heroism. Emanuel Ringelblum, there was a stamp put out in his memory here in Israel, going back a few decades already. And I would say that he still probably is not spoken about as much as Mordechai Anilevich, but I think he's spoken about much more than 30, 40 years ago. And the books that have come out, let's say from the Eish Kodesh, etc., those books have been very popular here in Israel.
Thank you. Excellent. Have a wonderful day. Boker Tov. And
have a good evening, all of the rest of you.
Everyone else. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Have a wonderful day.
Thank you. It was great.